Ciao Antonio,
Hola Alberto.
how's it going?
Good, thank you.
Ciao
Nice
Alberto.
to see you. Wait, is that Antonio? Hi Antonio.
Oh,
I can just see your library, not you.
Antonia.
che dai.
Hola Donald.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Bien, ¿y tú?
Bien. ¿Qué tal?
Acá.
¿Dónde estás? ¿En Canadá?
Ujú.
¿Está frío?
Nevó ayer.
Nevó, mamma mia. Oddio.
Spring.
So
Gosh.
so have a good talk.
Thanks for joining. I think maybe we can get started, even if the music is really creating a nice atmosphere. And I want to thank Azelia Terzi, our event coordinator, and Letizia Lasorte, our communication intern, for having chosen this very cool music for the warm-up. And my name is Donatella Della Ratta. I am an associate professor of communications and media studies here at John Cabot University in Rome. And we are hosting today our last event for this pandemic edition of the Digital Delights and Disturbances lecture series, which inaugurated in very different circumstances, actually, on site in Rome in spring 2019. So this was the first pandemic edition, the first time that we hosted our speakers in this virtual setting and or hybrid, also in the case of queer data. In this cycle, we have integrated ourselves with the help of our speakers on several issues that have become more prominently visible during the pandemic and probably because of the pandemic. Just to recap a little bit, we have opened the lecture series with a reflection on the platformization of life, the increasing pervasiveness of digital platforms into every single aspect of our daily life, from learning and teaching to eating and socializing, with Zoom parties and Zoom aperitivos, which we have all pretty much experienced. We have speculated about possible escape routes and ways to de-platformize our existence. In the second event, Queer Data, which was really an experiment, we have revolted against the increasing, or tried to revolt against the increasing quantification of the self pushed by algorithmic cultures and data capitalism, and experimented a queer way of being a data revolt against data. We have come together with trans writers from across the world and transhuman entities such as our own robot, Comi, to celebrate a nod to queerness and find new ways to embody resistance and dissent at the time of social distancing. A week ago, we reflected with the scholars and students on how Zoom fatigue is not so much about the burnout of the self, of the individual put under very severe pressure by our screen-mediated life, but rather a systemic dysfunction emerging from an imposed condition, which some people would like us to call the new normal, and against which, as Sean Kubit argues in a recent piece, we stand against. So today is the last but not least chapter of this journey of the pandemic edition of Digital Delights and Disturbances. The talk today is called Digital Contagions, from network security to viral capitalism, and will focus on a number of key and very contemporary issues, such as the emergence of viruses in the specific of network culture as a security issue, to something much broader connected to the inherent logic of viral capitalism. And we are very proud to have here virtually today with us Jussi Parikka, and hopefully in the future on site in Rome. Jussi Parikka, who is a professor of technological culture and aesthetics at the University of Southampton in the UK, and a visiting professor at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague, Czech Republic. He leads the project Operational Images and Visual Culture, and he is the author of several seminal books on digital culture, media archaeology, and cultural theory. And just to mention a little bit to boost also, because Jussi has a history here with Italy, and we are in Italy. So his recently translated book, Archaeologia dei Media, for Carocci Edizioni, won the Premio Limina in the category of Best Italian Translation, of an important contribution to film studies. Of more recent books, there is to mention the co-edited book, Photography of the Scale, and the forthcoming book, The Lab Book. But today we're going to focus on Digital Contagions, which actually first appeared in 2007, and it's part of an amazing trilogy together with Insect Media 2010 and Geology of Media 2015. But in 2016, there was a second edition of Digital Contagions, which was released with a new preface by Sean Cabot, which I have just quoted before. So now, without further hesitation, I will leave the virtual floor to Jussi Parikka. Jussi, benvenuto. Thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to host you in Rome soon. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Grazie. Grazie mille. It's such a pleasure to join you, and first on the virtual floor, and soon on other floors and pavements in Rome, I'm sure. I'm really grateful for being part of the seminar program. And it's great that you just summarized the whole really exciting breadth of topics that's been discussed, and I'm really glad that I can be part of this, and that of the and with great speakers and topics as well. Thank you so much, Donatella and everybody else for organizing this, and the whole series indeed. As mentioned, what we discussed with Donatella as well is that I should focus on my slightly older work because of the theme of delights and digital delights and disturbances. I guess I'll bring the disturbance into the mix, especially with the topic of digital contagions, as mentioned already. It's work that sort of I did early on. So a lot of the research, and I'll speak more about this. This is just sort of I'm giving you a bit of a opening ramble first. It really is research that emerges in early 2000s, but I was able to revise and revisit that just a couple of years ago, almost a 10-year edition of that book, Digital Contagions, that I'm happy that Sean Cabot wrote the preface for as well. Before going into that, I'll just briefly mention, because this might be also a nice warm-up, as we talked about the sort of aperitivo for possible later things as well, is that the thing that I'm doing in Prague as director of the Operational Images project is part of the research I'm mostly engaged in now as well, which sort of refers to Harun Farocchi's notion of operational images that has been picked up. But in the research team, we're sort of using that notion not only to investigate Farocchi, but also to open up to, let's say, histories and contemporary practices of visuality and digital images, but also beyond digital imaging, to look at the ways in which surveillance works, the ways in which other sorts of machine vision systems work, but also reaching out to what I'm trying, for instance, doing now is trying to write a short book that rewriting would sound way too, glamorous and grand. I'm not doing anything as big as rewriting, but I'm trying to look at how does history of photography and history of visuality and history of technical images look from the point of view of operational images. So how to look at things slightly differently as well. And the other topic that I'm mostly engaged with is with Abelardo Gil Fournier, who's an artist we just released last autumn, a joint video essay, and relates to a bigger topic we're doing on environmental imaging and so-called green surfaces. So those are the things that I'm mostly occupied at the moment, but I was glad to, given that I got this opportunity to go back to discussions about virality and contagions and security, which are of course central for reasons that we don't need to remind ourselves about. But there's also a couple of intersecting lines of thought that I will mention. Let me also put on my shared screen. I don't have any fancy PowerPoint. There's just a couple of quotes on the PowerPoint, which will be helpful probably when I read quotes as well. And I'll speak probably for about 20-25 minutes or something like that. And then after that, we'll have plenty of time for discussions. But let me share my screen as well. Let's see, it should be here. I hope if you don't see my screen as in the PowerPoint, shout, but I think you should be seeing it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great, thank you. So yeah, as I was saying, a couple of intersecting lines of thought that are sort of like the background against which I want to talk about computer viruses and digital contagions. And on the one hand, one could refer to this theme, sort of a general theme of contagious cultural patterns that have defined a whole material epistemology of contagions. Contagions as an object of interest for decades as well. That contagions, as we know now, are very concrete and yet at the same time abstract as they're modeled and simulated, even diagrammed in scientific abstractions as well, a topic that I recently engaged with Tony Sampson in an article as well. Contagions are constantly and have been for decades modeled. They have been, and they provide a backbone of understanding to these relations or relationality that has to do with contagions as a social phenomena as well, to say the obvious. And on the other hand, digital contagion specifies in relation to computer viruses indeed, and their context in computer security, where the question is basically what are these forms of software contagions and how did they become described as such? So my work in that book and this research topic emerges from my, I was trained as a historian, and this was also basically my PhD as well, and I had to do the whole framework of thinking about computer viruses through a historical note. So basically the book itself and some of the couple of things I'll mention soon relate to really a certain kind of a historical way of understanding computer viruses from 1960s to the birth of the popular internet in 1990s and then early 2000s, and in the new edition with a couple of notes about more recent ways in which computer security has been reframed as well in terms of more recent events as well. But it's not a full take on everything that has to do with computer security, but it has to do with these topics that are at the center of the seminar series as well. So in terms of structure today as well, these are the kind of, I wanted to pick a couple of key themes and through which, and through sort of like basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to sample a couple of key notions under each of these three things, and sort of like this way offer a way of getting into a discussion and a Q&A mode at the end of this as well, and perhaps then we can sort of speak to the topics of where might or might not any of this be relevant in the current context as well, unless we are totally sick of talking about COVID as well. And I can sort of, we can, in that Q&A session, I can sort of point to, I sort of have been refraining from doing anything. The last thing I felt like last spring as well, a year ago, was that the last thing we need are any grand theoretical notions about what is contagions, because it was more of a quite a different sense of urgency. But slightly later, I did a couple of commissioned pieces that had to do with masks and racialization through masks as well. And then I did something with Tony Sampson besides the diagram piece, but also what I'll talk about that later as well. So if I kind of continue with number one, this general accidents. So as mentioned, the book was meant to be a historical mapping of these security concerns that relate to being in touch. Both epistemologically, the idea that contagion stems from being in touch, something that Sean Cubitt also points in the preface to that book as well, is being in touch, and specifically then, in our case, not just the human touch, but the since 1980s, about networking, driven by an idea of a maximization of communication, but which had to be then negotiated against the backdrop of communication becoming a threat, becoming a sort of a general accident, as I started calling it in this book as well. It was meant to be a contribution to network studies and internet studies and digital culture studies, but also illuminating a particular kind of a cultural history of the phenomenon as well. To state the obvious, of course, when I say general accident, it was meant as a very explicit nod to Paul Virilio and Paul Virilio's way of thinking and of articulating since what, at least 1980s, even in earlier writings of Virilio, the notion of the contemporary technological conditions as defined by its accidental possibilities as well, but also cultural historians like Wolfgang Schivelbusch, who I'll mention soon. So let me do a short sample of the couple of key themes in that section of general accident first. The history of media and technology is a history of accidents. Things break down almost as often as they actually do what they're supposed to do. We fantasize about machines of ultimate communication that always work and that always function. But the reality is different and goes back to a variety of technologies of movement, communications, and transmission in which accidents start to happen. The train introduced a train accident, with the boat came the boating accident, and inherent in several techniques of data storage, including even before digital, such as papyrus, paper, film, there's always the possibility of erasure of information. Media are always in this sense embodied. Whatever we think about the fallacies of immateriality of data, things decay and they rot. And any communication medium is vulnerable to passing of time, as much as the speed, indeed, a nod to Paul Virilio, the speed that might cause a crash. One could indeed write a whole shadow history of technology through it, how it doesn't work, how it breaks down, how it frustrates, it messes things up, how it disappoints and doesn't meet up with the expectations that are always rather sublime compared to mundane everyday. So it was already the telegraph, if you want to go that far, it's 19th century, the early network technology of the 19th century, how it was perceived to be vulnerable to such problems is in this case a slightly random anecdote, but still, for the sake of it, by Dr. Barbet, a semaphore enthusiast. It's up there, but I'll read it anyway. No, the electric telegraph is not a sound invention. It will always be at the mercy of the slightest disruption, wild youth, drunkards, bums. The electric telegraph meets those destructive elements with only a few meters of wire over which supervision is impossible. A single man could, without being seen, cut the telegraph wires leading to Paris, and in 24 hours, cutting down different places the wires of the same line without being arrested, right? So this sort of a construction of the accidental leads much beyond the internet context of digital accidentals as well, and relates to similar kinds of concerns in terms of management, supervision, and control that have become, of course, again, since 1990s, those key terms for the digital condition of what is an accident. As technological accidents have a history, but so do diseases. Causes of diseases, which since the 19th century, to put it roughly, have been mainly recognized as harmful, minuscule actors of sorts, infectious viruses, as well as bacteria. They affect the very basics of human societies. And again, I was writing some of this in 2007, so now it might sound a bit obvious, but still. Bacteria and viruses accompany the so-called human world among the other species we share space with. And diseases are themselves conditioned by a variety of social mechanisms. The spatio-temporal occurrence of a disease, an outbreak, is always set in a field of definitions of what caused it, where did it originate, of sanitation measures, of security measures, and other ways to control the territory. And of course, COVID has been a great example, a horrible example, of an unfolding of multiple forms of media technological control as well. In any case, diseases tell a story of society. Diseases are symptomatic of the ways cultures interact. They reveal parts of communication and commerce, of interaction and cultural hierarchies, which form the networks of a society. What affects what, who affects who frequents whom and where, and so forth. Diseases, in short, expose. The improvement of road networks from late antiquity exposed populations to a growing number of infectors. The Silk Road, the historical one, not just the recent one, was such a network of goods as well as germs from China to Europe and the other way round. A major change occurred with urbanization, industrialization, and the new transmission channels of steamships, railroads, and airplanes, which connected people and germs, unfortunately, more efficiently than ever. The Black Death that infected Europe in the mid-14th century and recurred was to a large extent an expression of the new path of communication and transmission paved, among others, by the Mongol Empire, as well as the new ship routes connecting the Mediterranean to the northern parts of Europe as well. In the 19th century, steam in the form of locomotives and transoceanic ships helped microorganisms to create this single near-global disease pool already. Transmission and communication have always shifted geopolitical boundaries, and any consideration of the global should be aware of this role that germs, in a very broad term germs here, play. How geopolitics can be read through diseases and their paths and reaction to those paths. Ships are still in modern times the clandestine transport vehicle of diseases, to name an example. Whether we call it the plague of psychoanalysis in metaphoric terms, as Freud quipped to Jung when they entered New York Harbor, or then the mythical figure of Count Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel of 1897, what else is it than an infection? Transmission and communication come with a cost, and an anxiety of established borders becoming all mixed up and trespassed, order must be restored. At the end of the 20th century, another form of technological accident caused an immense amount of public anxiety. It seemed to combine those lineages of earlier technological accidents, but also this sort of a notion of disease patterns or even viral patterns as well. And it seemed to produce a truly novel situation. Computer viruses and worms, as the latest occurrence in the history of diseases of sorts, causes something that was referred to even as in very gender terms as hysteria, the key gender disease of previous fan de siècle as well. Viruses become a sign of the fan de millennium, indications that uncontrolled threats of late modern technological mass society, alongside a range of other threats that populated 1980s, 1990s in different ways, whether we're talking biology or whether we're talking social patterns or technology, from Chernobyl to HIV virus to Ebola virus and whatnot. So digital viruses threaten to turn digital memory banks, I quote, into terminal gibberish. As Wolfgang Schiebelbusch notes, before industrialization, accidents seem to refer to coincidences that attacked as if from outside, that just happened, sometimes perhaps divine intervention or just a natural catastrophe such as storms and floods. But in the case of industrial machines and industrial way of systematization of how we think, the accident became also seen as an internal problem, as technologies seem to potentially turn on themselves as a result of their own powers. The recent decades of global technological infrastructures have seen a range of such accidents as well, but they're perceived as risks, as risk management, as risk minimization, as signification through risk, but also financialization and valorization as risk, both in terms of, as mentioned, finance, but also in terms of mass media system, as in terms of what later, for instance, Richard Grusing called premediation of risks or particular kinds of effective attunement to a future that might happen or might not happen as well. So that sort of a Cold War period utopias of global village and the vast number of accounts that celebrated networks and cyberspaces later on, as these non-places of recent decades, showed their flip sides to be this dystopia of global risks and accidents. So it's in this kind of a vein that I sort of engage with the sort of try to frame the historical and this historical historians hat on way of reading sources, of trying to both tell a story and doing original source work that related to, for instance, reading basically computer manuals and computer related texts and whatnot from 1960s, but also some interviews with people who were active in early network projects in 1970s and 1980s, to also then sort of a like visual production of these things as well, right? But in that context, I was interested, and this is probably the reason why I perhaps never became a proper historian in the traditional sense, at least. I was interested in how this way of framing a sort of a 50 years of computer viruses, even if computer viruses more or less emerged in more technical literature in 1980s, and then in popular sort of a consciousness and with a much more widespread examples in 1990s, and the rest is history, as we know, even if computer viruses are nowadays not probably the main computer security threat at all in terms of what we're discussing or should be worried about. But they represent this particular period of thinking through contagions, both inside and outside digital contexts, so to speak, as well. But it was also for me a platform for thinking through concepts and thinking through what kinds of concepts would be able to capture the sorts of mechanisms that are partly technological, partly they relate to particular industries like security industry, partly they build upon the sort of a like key context of let's say, what's the term to use, cultural understanding, but also cultural uses of power through contagions, as in HIV virus and AIDS, and the ways in which it and I'll come back to this soon, it related to sexualities, homophobia, multiple other forms of sort of uses of power. If we look at, for instance, US in 1980s. Anyway, but one key focus was, to put it bluntly, the C word, as in capitalism, that sort of exhibited itself through what I kind of tried to read through the sources as well as a form of, well, I mean, this is not a surprise, but still a commercialization of security, commercialization of threats, and commercialization of risks, which of course then you could say that besides the particular case study, it also offered a way of thinking about this in broader terms that is very prevalent for multitude of sectors in contemporary context of pre-mediation of risks, as mentioned, and multiplication of risk scenarios as a way of epistemologically thinking of what is our world, but also how to financialize it as well. And of course, this has been done by a lot of theorists over the past 15 years in outstanding ways. And I'll just mention a couple of them now as well. So, as mentioned, part of the context was more than the security industry, but it's still central. So 1980s and 1990s, we can talk about certain interest in viruses in science fiction as a place for viruses, and similar kinds of autonomous and semi-autonomous software programs, even AI programs were featured as well. And there's a whole interesting history of artificial life and AI research that related to contagions and, well, self-replicating mechanisms, of course, both in science fiction of 1970s, but also then in computer science discussions in 60s, 70s, and then again in artificial life since 1980s as well. So you can see that this relates to a couple of other current topics as well. But I also wanted to speak through the notion of security by way of trying to pitch it as viral capitalism, a concept that might seem obvious, but let's see if you like it. A lot of the themes in computer security and software culture seem to hint of this peculiar trend. If these security problems would not exist, it would be as beneficial to invent them, to invent different forms of accidents to keep the industry going. This idea that if it's not broken, break it, provides an interesting way to approach the functioning of the so-called information capitalism. And you can see how it resonates with a certain kind of a, again, I'll use it slightly sounding a bit too academic here, but discursive production of notions of, you know, Silicon Valley type of mentality and risk mentality and multiple other sorts of things as well about the value of things being broken down, right? The glamorization of risks also in venture capital culture of digital corporations, Silicon Valley, etc., is one example, but it might be said to apply also to security software and services, which is a slightly tricky thing because, of course, some of this is very much needed. It's not that we're wanting to paint a grim picture of the whole whole security industry, far from it, not at all. And of course, what I, as a historian, wanted to point out in that context as well is that similar trends occurred in the cultural history of diseases, biological diseases, and sanitations for a long time in multiple contexts. For instance, just an example, Nancy Tomes in her History of Germs in US, America, the fear of microbes for us, at least since 1880s, turned into a lucrative business with special goods and services designed for, indeed, hygiene. This meant, for example, safeguards against the danger of sewer gas and polluted water, special toilet attachments, household water filters, and on to antiseptic floor coverings, as well as wall paint, sanitary dish drainers, fly traps, and whatnot. And you can think of these in ways in which that contrasts and resonates with the ways in which we have been covering surfaces and paying attention to surfaces in the past year as well. So there's an interesting relation, the particular, history of, say, the obvious history of hygiene. And of course, there's people who are much more specialized in this topic than I am, but it's more of a quick mention. Dangers and risks made an easy entry to the consumer market, which aimed to provide tools for controlling the uncertainties and anxieties of everyday life. These themes can be synthesized under the notion of viral capitalism, which stems from an idea, and this is very simple at this stage still, idea of capitalism as a capable of continuous modulation and heterogenesis. In other words, that it produces differences and it produces variations, and it's able to capture those variations in its own right. So the object virus actually stems from this broader theme of virality and this idea that virality is not only the thing to be contained, but it's also the logic of spreading, and even to an extent, and this sounds a bit grandiose, logic of capitalism in those terms as well. Technology and things like software might be only an index, they might be a proxy, it might be one example of this more immanent logic that spreads across scales and registers of culture. And the virus itself is, in those terms, also an interesting example, an example object as well, a software object, as an index of the capitalist drive towards virality, that is operations based on contagion and mutation and colonization of various networks as well. So the power in capitalism in those terms would reside in the capability to appropriate the outside as part of itself, to incorporate the ability to subsume heterogeneity, all these variations, all these differences, all these multiple forms of things that we celebrate as difference, as part of its production machinery. In this way, it works more as an abstract machine, as our Deleuzian colleagues called it in many contexts as well, an abstract machine of invention that also reproduces itself all the time, that is not only tied to particular transcendent points of what is capital, but is able to adapt itself to different scales, whether it's the nation state, whether it's transnational corporations, whether it's the ways in which even risks and threats can be financialized. I won't go into detail at this point at all. I'll skip the details here because I think that it's perhaps interesting enough already to hint to the idea that it's the possibilities of financialization, monetization, and valorization that are at the back of certain scale of virality and contagion as well. And in the book, I develop it through reading Brian Masumi's work, Jody Dean's work on circulation, right? I even read, what now this feels like, canon of those days, Harden Negri's Empire, which itself premised in very similar kinds of thoughts about appropriation and capture at the center of these processes of capital, which I felt are quite apt when considering the security industry as well. And I would dare to claim that it has this sort of really interesting relation to contemporary forms of security industries, digital and non-digital as well. But again, without going into details and without going into theoretical readings, I sort of then build on Harden Negri through another great Italian theorist, Luciana Parisi's work, and Luciana's early work as well, that relates very much to the same themes of what she calls endosymbiosis of capitalism, this endosymbiotic capitalism that itself works, and I'm not going to put words in Luciana's mouth, but works in these ways like an organism of capture, an organism of self-replication, and an organism of variation, right? So there's a lot of really interesting ways that the particular kind of an object that is the short bit of software code, for instance, is itself, my attempt was to read it as a multi-scalar unit through which to understand this flexible global capitalism that itself becomes easily either, big abstraction, but it's sort of a resurfaces in this context of software, both the virus as a threat, but then the other topic that I want to go into would be how self-replicating software, sort of these AI type software units in 1980s and 1990s, were really, the whole discourse of artificial life and AI then was premised on ideas of adaptation, flexibility, adjustability, and learning, right? So the forms of rethinking of what is artificial intelligence was, again, going back to some examples that computer scientists back then as well, saying that, wow, let's look at computer viruses as a live example of this sort of patterns as well. And there would be much more examples that we could go into. Very briefly, because I know that I'm taking too much time, is the third topic as well, the vulnerable body. Last and very briefly, just due to lack of time, not because it was any less important, the question of viruses and contagions in this context that I was working on was very much prescribed in relation to assumptions of health. Sort of a kind of weird oxymoronic, or sort of a like neologism, I don't know what to call it, of digital health and digital immunity and all kinds of weird sort of a like metaphoric, but also I would say not just metaphoric, but institutionalized ways of trying to understand of what is a network, for instance, right? Assumptions of health and these healthy bodies as this idealized unit. That's, of course, our work in cultural studies and media studies has been of the decades of problematization of what is the normative healthy body as well. This is exactly the work that comes through from feminist theory to queer theory to whatnot as well. So it was really interesting to read this in a seemingly immaterial context, which it of course isn't, as well, of how the notions of health and such emerge as well. So on the one hand, these constant forms of othering that happen through contagions or the risk of contagions were effectively mobilized through tropes that implied that software, this kind of a contagious software, illegal softwares as well, were a security threat and threatened the body or the body politic as such as well. So there was a lot there about the different scales of the body politics, whether it's the body politics of corporations or the nation state and so forth, right? And on the other hand, it took place in the midst of and against the backdrop of especially the decades of HIV virus and AIDS, 1980s, the political mobilization of that by US right-wing conservatives, and not just US right-wing conservatives, and how it related to a broader way of discursive production and whatnot, relating to questions of sexuality, and a very kind of a like violent and discursive and material production of, against homosexuality, against queers and so forth. But also in terms of questions of immigration and ethnicity, which popped up in those terms as well quite frequently. So it was very obvious then that even it wasn't explicit always, it was implied there always that any expressions of virality was intentionally or accidentally also to be read in these terms of what the viral meant and who was composing and it as a threat and by whom. And again, sort of this social history of a technical accident as well. So while I read some of this against the very gendered and sexualized tropes of the body of the 1980s and 1990s, and sometimes in very seemingly harmless, quote unquote funny, cartoonish ways in which illegal software, but also other threats were pitched, as in this case as well. It's again interesting how these themes have been resurfacing, of course, as well in our current context. But I want to finish off with just a kind of a let's put it like this. It's plucked from some of the discussions in my book, but I want to end with this sort of an inspirational quote, if I may, that was central to my writing and nicely fits into the alternative stream of trying to articulate the kind of a politics of the viral and in terms of its significance from the point of view of a variety of let's say, voices within the broader field as well, and not merely echoing the voices of security industries, but in this case, for instance, Luca Lampo from Epidemic as well. It is really kind of a for me, it's a really great way of condensing a lot of the feelings around early 2000s, which I would claim have persisted as well, of reducing this the viral and the virus as this uncontrollable diversity, and in Luca's words as well, it continues how once Hollywood like empire finished killing off indigenous people and the Soviet Russians, the Hollywood propaganda machine had to build other anti-empire monsters to keep alive the social imaginary of 2001's aliens, meteors, epidemic, so many monsters. Of course, now we know as well that forms of racialization and racial violence have definitely not disappeared anywhere, quite the contrary, but it sort of puts this into the context of how also the social history of digital contagions was constantly back and forth moving across these other political spectrums, not only media representations, but this sort of like post-Cold War era that then sort of became the post 9/11 era, and after that, God knows what post as well, in terms of the multiplication of discourses and measures of security as well. So really the last words at the back of this, I really wanted to, with this short intro, to refer to this mix of politics of naming and discursive power and the politics of material flows, the fact that it's also material in multiple ways and through code and its relation to lived bodies as well. The non-discursive production of code and software and network events, security breaches, contagions, all of this is in constant tension. And part of the aim of my research and the book as well, and what I'm still interested in is exactly the question of how to offer space to also contesting claims about what is security and what sort of bodies and what sort of contagions and through what kind of mechanisms they're being defined. And I want to finish there, but one of the things that I sort of want to preempt already might be the discussion about, and I'm using this very broadly, the questions of visualization of contagions and visualization of viruses as well, that often relates to visualization of biological viruses in specialist techniques, but there's an interesting way that it perhaps relates to our questions of digital platforms and digital ways of understanding contagion as well. So that's my introduction. Thank you very much for listening, but let's move on to discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jussi. This was a very rich introduction, and I wish we had more time, and I wish we were in Rome instead of being on Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, okay, as a rule, I want to remind the audience, actually, I didn't mention it before, that we're committed to stop this, to end this debate at 7:30 p.m. Rome time. So we have about, about 40 minutes to discuss. I want to take, I want to draw inspiration on a couple of things that you have said, but then I want to pass on to my colleagues and hopefully also the students, the participants, so I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about this very rich introduction. I have to say that, you know, listening to also you recapping the book, it's really a groundbreaking, pioneering work. If you think that this was authored in 2007, so more than 10 years ago, wow, it's amazing the ways in which this book touches upon so many issues that are so relevant to our life today. So the book is very rich. The introduction also was really rich. I want to touch upon a couple of things that you have mentioned, and maybe connect them also to your latest piece, which you have authored with Tony Sampson, and people who are interested can read it in Cultural Politics. There is a special issue on viral culture released just a couple of months ago, in which Jussi and Tony Sampson have authored this amazing piece called The Operational Loops of the Pandemic. So you have underlined that diseases tell the story of society, of societies. And my question would be, so thinking about, unfortunately, I don't think we can avoid talking about COVID, which it's our reality today. So if diseases tell the story of societies, then what story is COVID-19 telling now, narrating about our own societies? This would be a topic that I think for me, it's of a great interest also, again, in connection to the work that you have done with Tony Sampson in this article, in which you talk about the visualization of diseases, of viruses, and the ways in which visualization becomes visuality, a la Mirzoeff. So a precise orientation of the gaze, which becomes, again, to quote Farooqi, operational. So, I mean, these visualizations are no longer just representational, but are indeed operational. So they push people to do something. And, you know, we are on the verge here in Italy of a new government decree who's going to tell us that the situation is improving. And so on Monday, we can open the restaurants until 10 maybe, or maybe they will push the curfew until 11. But so all these decisions that are affecting our lives and bodies are indeed based very much on simulation and visualization, which becomes, again, a sort of, it's definitely visuality. So, and also in the article, you touch upon something which is very much embedded in the history also of visual culture as a discipline, which is the connection with colonization. So it's a fascinating moment in which you talk about the ways in which the curve and the wave as metaphors were in fact kind of invented during the colonial period, and then you say that these metaphors were employed to describe epidemics that were inflicted on colonized population as organic events. So something that colonial powers had nothing to do with and no responsibility whatsoever, and they were marked as foreign things, a little bit like you have said at the end of the talk, you know, the metaphor of the Cold War, the enemy, or also war on terror, you know, so something that it's out of our control. And if we go back to the beginning of the narrative, you know, shaping the narrative for COVID-19, that's pretty much the same thing that happened, you know, so Wuhan, the Chinese virus. So it seems to me that there is this fil rouge, this connection also on the history of visualization and visuality as connected to the colonial period. So I will stop it. But yeah, I wonder if you can elaborate on these points.
Yeah, no, I think you made a really great entry point already to the multiple scales, which both in terms of the geopolitical and the sort of both in terms of what kind of a narrative unfolds, or what is even the form, what is even the genre of the narrative that unfolds in relation to the contemporary year of contagions. And then the other, if I kind of put it like that, and then the other question is what is the image of a contagion? Two things that might be slightly related as well. If I start from the latter as well, perhaps it's slightly easier because I can sort of build on what you already mentioned about the article as well. And it also relates to my interest in earlier times about seeming invisibility of contagions as well, both in biological terms and hence as sort of the really weird aesthetic question of what does a contagion look like. That was partly a dilemma when I was dealing with digital contagions because software event doesn't really look like anything. We're approaching it through proxies of things breaking down, for instance. And in a similar way, the format of proxies, both architectural proxies in urban situations, whether it's signs or whether it's different, sanitation and hygiene points and all kinds of, temporary structures for COVID testing to whatnot, would be one example of the proxies at which the contagion becomes manifested both as an urban situation and as well as a border situation, and I'm talking about national borders as well, and that's another kind of the key point at which it's happening. So there's something about this format of the proxy, first of all, that becomes interesting in terms of both the invisibility of the sort of the constant risk question that we've been facing, and I can't comment, but I'm pretty much guessing that it's very similar patterns in Italy as well in terms of the discourse of invisibility of being a carrier, that you don't know and you act like you have it just in case, vis-a-vis the question of the constant visual production of images of the virus itself as the spiky blob image that was produced. But then the sort of really the technical images like diagrams and curves and statistics, which I'm fascinated about as well. So while on the one hand, we often focus on the sort of the spiky blob itself as the image of the virus, I think that's completely secondary to, the ways in which these almost, I want to call them in the sort of a Farocki way, these non-images of diagrams and statistical curves and the discourse around flattening the curve that was central for a lot of the multinational discourses about trying to control, trying to enable, ensure that there's enough hospital places and the usual things so it was the management by this visual graph format was to me an interesting way of and like many others have also pointed out, anthropologists and others, they're building this sort of a sense of authority, but also that it has a operationality built into it as well. Operationality that is both a guideline, is both a sort of a implied collective biopolitical measure, and it's also implied by way of what else do we talk about, this sort of a question of numbering in terms of how, under which kind of mathematical premises and what are the history of those mathematical premises of what is a modeling of a contagion. And that's where you, as you mentioned, the article mentions other people's work who've done much more sort of a fine-tuned historical works about, for instance, British colonial relation to India and the sort of forms of contagion modeling that were happening in India in late 19th century, early 20th century. So it's the classical case of, Foucault and others mentioned as well, that the colonies were the test beds, not only for military actions and security actions in those terms, but also in terms of, for instance, epidemics as well. So it's this sort of like a really interesting political history of the epidemic as such, as the modern epidemic as well, as how it relates to, and this perhaps comes to that question of the narrative, how it relates to the particular format of the nation state, but also the imperial or the colonial nation state, especially in this case, as well as a sort of a format of being able to produce scientific base for understanding what is a contagion, but also in this context, there's sort of a resurfacing of the strict nation state borders that happened as well as part of the biopolitical sort of a cordoning across, even in Europe as well, as we know. So I would say that there's something very central about the narrative about borders indeed, and I'm not saying anything that is quite, I mean, others have said it in much, better terms as well, but I want to highlight that as well. And I find extremely problematic as well, this for, on the one hand, being very aware of necessity of health measures, but also the sudden love of borders that is appearing even in some leftist literature is to me extremely worrying. Instead of other forms of governmentality of, for instance, contagions across borders as well. And I'm of the school that no leftist project it can't embrace nation-state borders in a consistent manner. But that's a slightly different and longer discussion. And then, of course, in relation to that, that again you mentioned, I'm saying obvious things as well, but there are forms of racialization and racial violence that had sort of exploded as part of this as well, and the ways in which, for instance, in Britain, it's there. It's not just a COVID year. It's also the how many years of Brexit, and the resurfacing of particular kinds of nationalist right-wing tropes that sort of like came together at the moment of racialization of. First, it was racialization of people who were wearing masks and Asian, for instance, in our case, Asian students, and then in other sorts of formats that you also mentioned as well, on a geopolitical level, not to even mention the previous US president that we don't need to name anymore, but beyond that, in terms of all the geopolitical measures that now relate to, of course, the weird mix of nation-state politics and their relation to patents, for instance, or patents of vaccines as well, and the ways in which they're incredibly bizarre, and I just can't get my head around it. Love of patents, even in this case, by the nation states, whereas there's clear mechanisms for making all of these patent-free, the vaccines for production as well. It's mind-boggling, and one of the key sort of like key threads of the whole narrative would be something about the mix of the nation state as itself, painting itself, and I'm using this in very broad terms, and I hope people also can read through my lines and sort of relate it to their own experiences. They're sort of like the particular trope of the nation state as the victim, that, you know, that's why we need to close the borders and to make sure that we're controlling, and yet at the same time, no political will to break patents and interfere with the sort of like patent rule of global capitalism. Those two things are the conflicting tensions that really is driving this whole big mess of COVID COVID politics of money and vulnerable people and whatnot. I hope that sort of like gets into some of the topics that you also had in mind.
Oh, definitely. This is extremely fascinating. Thank you so much, Jussi. I would like to continue the conversation, but I know there are other burning questions. So I would like to give the floor to Alberto Micali and then Antonio Lopez. I know they have questions for you.
Okay, thanks, Jussi. Yeah, building upon what you said, I mean, just to be also making some connections also with the whole lecture series, because again, your book again is also very timely, as we were saying, also in letting us understanding a little bit better the current pandemic, the current situation. I mean, for sure, I agree with you. We don't need grand narratives about the COVID situation, but for sure, I think that you have been offering, you have been building also the tools to approach the contemporary situation throughout all your works, and especially the approach you're having in studying digital cultures and contemporary media. So just to connect a little bit to your presentation, because with the COVID, and again, touching upon the current situation, again, the kind of discourse networks that have been done about COVID have all been trying to frame it as a sort of evil alterity, these alien viruses never existed before. So in some way, reproposing this kind of logic you were already studying. So it looks like it's still alive. And also your point, again, also your points about viral capitalism. We have been having a session in this Digital Delights and Disturbances series about platform capitalism and the way in which it monetizes the whole situation. Okay, so the way the COVID also boosted the revenues of these platforms and also their dominant position.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, we see this kind of continuity also with this kind of axiomatic or viral logic you were describing, which is another kind of nice connection. And finally, you're also discussing about the body, and again, we found ourselves in this kind of situation with our embodiments that are in threat with the virus, and again, we are all facing this kind of situation. Again, with the virus as the enemy, but you also were telling something else also with the final quote in your work. Wait a sec, maybe viruses are not necessarily dangerous. Okay, we have different types of viruses. And your approach, since you have built this kind of also ecological approach, again, maybe one of the questions also we were doing with my students is, can we think of the aesthetics of the virus, the artistic side of the virus, again, in ways that is not necessarily damaging us and damaging our culture. So yeah, maybe if you want to.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And this was also the sort of a like now and then, I mean, dilemma in terms of like, on the one hand, you know, if one would go in the streets and say that it's not, you know, the virus is our friend, the virus is not the enemy, you wouldn't get positive responses. But it's without going into sort of a silly jokes, it is exactly the format of in which terms do we speak of the virus as having a particular kind of agency. Or, you know, besides the virus, it's most likely capitalism that will kill us, and it's doing it as well. And there's something quite appealing. First, I mean, I really like the ways in which you frame the connection between platform capitalism and viral capitalism. I'm not sort of ready to the term that we need to speak of everything as viral capitalism, but it's exactly the formats of capture that the platform is a great example of, that is able to really interestingly, as people who are probably in the seminar series already outlined as well, is that the ability to be able to mediate between questions of data and concrete bodies is quite central to the ways in the platform is so effective, a seemingly way of ability to you know, turn bodies into data and guide bodies through data, whether it's through gig work or whether it's through other forms of constant, you know, reformatting of the urban city, as we witnessed as well, in terms of what kinds of you know, usually underpaid or vulnerable work it relates to movement, and what it means in terms of turning the contagion into not just a modeling of the contagion as a virus pattern, but all the sort of other layers of data that it builds on then as well, in terms of, for instance, you know, particular platform businesses, whether it's Amazon logistics or whether it's particular gig work logistics having to do with Uber Eats and other things as well. So there's a clear link here to the format that is indeed exactly in those terms super interesting as well, and the ways in which it relates to race and racialization, and again in terms of what kind of patterns of work are there behind of it as well. The aesthetics and the kind of the question of the artistic side as well is interesting. I wouldn't speak of, I mean, I'm not going to mention anything in terms of like specific art projects about COVID. That's not, I don't think we're there yet. But for instance, in the case of Luca Lampo and you know, Italian context of media arts, but also other sorts of great examples, I think the value was always in the case of how they were. And to me, I mean, I teach in an art school, as somebody who wasn't taught and educated as an, you know, arts educator or art theorist, even if I tap into it quite a lot in my work, the value for me and the really interesting things are how they teach us to work across scales, right? So the aesthetics of virus in those terms, like some early 2000s Italian net art projects, or then some other examples, is the really exciting ways in which the ability to move across, you know, these scales of mentioning that, you know, the politics of othering of bodies or painting enemy pictures relates to the very kind of executable code, and these sort of a like completely seemingly inconceivable scales become articulated together as well. And I think that's why they also caught my eye as well, because they almost in themselves implied a different history of viruses, a different sort of a shadow reality of viruses. And it was, I think, Luca Lampo's quote as well might have been from this one exhibition that already in 2002, I mean, it was of course at the back of 1990s software net art, but still already in 2002, which museum in Frankfurt, but they hosted the I Love You exhibition, which was about I Love You virus, but also basically just stuff, you know, software coding and hacking as cultural practices. So it unfolds exactly into the sort of a like ways in which political statements and political articulations and cultural articulations were happening in context of software art, for instance, as well, that I found as for me, as a great way of understanding of what is the regime or the register of politics in software culture. So when other people were more directly, and of course, you know, great friends of the seminar from Herr Loving to many, many others as well have been articulating since 1990, and you know, seminar, your work in general here relates to it centrally, you know, the politics of network politics as such. This was sort of a like trying to tap into those by including also those kinds of, let's say, activist and artistic voices as well. And there's something about, and part of the work I'm complete in depth to Matthew Fuller and Matthew Fuller's way of thinking about early work on ecology, but also software art. And there's a wonderful phrase in one of his early books about software that, you know, it's something, I hope I don't misquote, but it's basically about, you know, it's not just art, it's a sort of like the not just art that is happening across the multiple kinds of early 2000 software projects that made it really appealing to me as a formulation of what is the institution in which aesthetics and art happens, that wasn't a traditional art institution and that had to carve its own, in many cases, carve its own institutional spaces and discursive spaces for circulation of these ideas about viruses, but also other kinds of software. And then there would be the thing that, you know, that this would relate to the bigger picture of security as well, of, you know, how to in positive ways undermine certain mainstream tropes of security and look at the ways in which they entangle with the dominant national but also corporate discourses of security. Again, an obvious point, but I think it was well executed by people, and for me, as said, it was a way of offering a platform for some of these voices. Not that they are without a platform, but hoping to amplify some of these ways of understanding digital economy and digital culture through a software artist.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Jussi. I think I'm next in line for a question.
Antonio.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation. And I thought, if possible, we could just bring up the fact that today's Earth Day and tie a little bit of what your talk today to some of the work you did in the geology of media. In particular, one of my favorite lines of your book is, before data mining, there's earth mining.
Yeah.
And you've used the term capture quite a bit. I wonder if by capture, do you mean also extractivism, like that capture is a type of extractivism the same way that extracting minerals from the earth for our media gadgets is. So I would just hope that you could say a little bit about this argument for the sake of our students, for the sake of Earth Day. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm sort of one of those academics who's going to say yes and no. On the one hand, is exactly the sort of a point that I find valuable in terms of trying to understand the linkage between what's been recently coined, and I'm not the one who's going to say we could have a longer debate if the term is successful, but data colonialism and the forms of extraction industries that were quite literally piggybacking on colonial expeditions, whether we're talking about South America's to other forms of fossil fuel extraction economies as well, and the ways in which at one point there was supposed to be the complete break between the old dirty oil extraction industries and the new glitzy digital industries as well. And this was the line that was produced, of course, by Silicon Valley as well, as the sort of like, okay, now we're moving into the new economy and it's not dirty anymore, and the ways in which it unfolds actually to their complete reliance on petrofossil energy and whatnot in terms of data centers, but also then in terms of also other forms where we start reading software events across scales, not just data storage, but also software events as through their energy consumption as well, and the ways in which that has its own political connotations in terms of heavy, sluggish corporate software, whereas the more energy efficient, open softwares, and all these kinds of questions that are super interesting as a way of reframing the questions of media. So on the one hand, I would say that yes, exactly, this is the ways in which extraction persists, extraction of things from the earth, in their finitude, and then extraction of data from bodies that are made to perform, are tempted to perform, that are constantly guided to perform on multiple forms of platforms, right? And yet at the same time, I've tried to get my head around this, and there's people who've done it in much more consistent ways. And I think, for instance, Benjamin Bratton and others have dealt with this as well, is that on the one hand, the form of the thing extracted, which would be either the finite mineral or the thing mined or the fossil fuel, and then the extraction of data seem to be correlating because of both are basically commodities, right? So the centrality of production of the commodities here central. So on the one hand, we could say that, okay, but it's slightly different because it's, raw materials and data, it doesn't work out, but it's the centrality is not in the metaphor of extraction so much as in the centrality of the commodity form that becomes central for whether it's a mineral as a commodity form and not just natural, and the thing extracted as data as not just digital data, but as a commodity itself. The difference usually comes in when we start thinking about questions of finitude and infinitude, right? Infinite as well, that, minerals and oil are part of the finitude of the planet, which is part of and the finitude of the planet is what we have having to deal with all of our politics nowadays as well. But data seems to be not of the same scale, which is something I haven't been able to resolve yet, but I think it's something about the relation that its data is not being so much extracted necessarily, but it's being constantly produced. So the format is slightly different, even if it's not, even if it is exploitative in terms of the practices, even if it's capturing particular commodity forms and through certain kinds of bodies and so forth, but it's still a production that is of slightly different order than extraction. And this would be longer philosophical debate, I guess. But and somebody else you might have better thoughts as well of how to think about this, and does it make any sense? But I'm trying to also save the possibilities, and I hope I'm not saying this in a complete, but I've been trying to think of ways in which certain forms of efficiency, and I'm using this in a slightly naive way, but also in a sort of a trying to be positive way, efficiency of particular forms of data capture. What would be the question is not the problems of the data capture, but the format of the commodity and the format of the economic format of how it's being coded as well. So in other words, I've been always a big fan of Tiziana Terranova's text as well, and the ways in which we can think about, what was her text some years ago, the red stack, in terms of these, basically, what are the post-capitalist forms of, for instance, networking, but also I would say, what are the post-capitalist forms of thinking by way of data capture or data production, and how would those deal with the question of extraction industries in ways that doesn't replicate the completely disastrous situation we are in as well. If you see what I mean, I'm trying to kind of develop this into a thought where we sort of try to understand that there's well, in simplest terms, the beneficiality of this efficiency of being able to read across massive data points and massive data sets as well, but ways in which that wouldn't reproduce, whether it's the racialized violence of particular machine vision and AI systems, or wouldn't reproduce particular other forms of problematic themes that we constantly deal with in our network politics. You see what I mean by this as well. It's slightly an open answer, but I'm sort of trying to hint that they're both and end of it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think we have a question from Fabio Cristiano from Leiden University. Fabio?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Donatella, and thank you, Jussi, for a fantastic lecture and presentation. I really appreciate particularly your kind of the reflexivity approach, right? Your way of reflecting on your past work. This was very interesting for me. And I want to ask a question along the same lines. Mm-hmm. One of the arguments I've always valued in your work is the point of the methodological issues, right? Of we should look at science and military context to understand media technology. That's a very important contribution that you do there. I was wondering, going back to this question of reflexivity, would you argue the same thing now, looking back at the evolution of media technologies?
That's super. I'm glad that you asked this, because exactly, it's sort of I came into media studies through that sort of a weird route of a cultural historian and historian of science and technology, and then completely be drawn into a particular kind of media theory indeed, and a particular, not only media theory. And for me, then it became a question of what is the media besides mass media, and media that is not about communication, which had its own legacies, and that's why I've been also attracted to particular kinds of thinkers as well. But now, in the context of writing about Farocchi, right? So Harun Farocchi's work, and to anyone who's not familiar with it, the key notion of the operational image is really interesting for exactly this question as well, right? So operational images for Farocchi are those kinds of images that are primarily not representational, but they operate. And usually for Farocchi, it was military systems, military missile guidance systems, machine vision systems, mostly for surveillance and others. Not exclusively military, but quite often when we talk about operational images, it's been related to especially weaponization of AI as surveillance, or machine vision as surveillance, and weaponization of platforms and infrastructure such as drones. But here's where I'm sort of in the very similar fashion that I'm still not abandoning the military at all. But for me, the operational image now has become this sort of a question of what would be the not just military history of this notion that seems to be central for contemporary forms of technical images. So for instance, now I've been digging into trying to read the question of the operational image as an image of measurement. So part of these forms of abstraction and quantification even before digital times that relate to bureaucratic procedures in 19th century, but also the kind of a curious examples that I've been going through in historical material is looking at, and the project is supposed to be about photography and technical images, but now I've been ending up looking at basically geodesic measurement of Earth surfaces in 18th century in expeditions, like a really famous or infamous one, French expedition to South Americas in 1736 as the core geodesic expedition, and then later work that has to do with photogrammetry. And these seem to be really like kind of like, why would you go there? But a lot of this has to do with the question of the measurement being articulated in colonial practices. So the sort of a like colonial underpinnings of the French expedition to what was then Spanish ruled territories in Peru and across, but also then later on, for instance, development of particular kinds of imaging practices and later photography of coastal lines and naval charts. That was pretty much the sort of like what I want to argue is the 18th century version, where it was partly military, but it was also just colonial, like East India Company and others. So there's something about that basically still works within that structure that you just mentioned, that it's the sort of a like a nitty-gritty, sometimes technical and scientific images, but they function in institutional settings that are really interesting. And those institutions in many of those contexts, and of course it's because I'm reading certain kinds of sources, French, German and British sources, that they are imperial. But there's a narrative there that I'm trying to build, and this is very much talking about work in progress, but it's so much about what you just asked, is I'm trying to build a case that really pairs up with what Ariel Azoulay has recently talked about, the sort of like the imperial underpinnings of photography. But I'm trying to say that I mean, completely in agreement, but also saying that it's not just photography, it was the ways in which certain things were measured. So it sounds a bit, but it's basically that short answer is that yes, and it's for me, it's trying to understand also this expanded notion of violence that perhaps is the expanded environmental violence that we just talked about with Antonio as well, but also in terms of this other forms of violence that has to do with colonialism, right?
We have one last question, Jussi, and then I'll promise we'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
There is Natalia Stanush, who is one of our students who wants to ask you a question.
Hi, Natalia.
Hello, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful talk. So I'll try to be very quick.
Sure.
So thinking about variability and contagion, and now looking at our presentations here on Zoom with pixelated screen-mediated reality, I was wondering if you would agree that the way of self-representation, thinking about selfies using filters which augment our faces, backgrounds, is some form of contagion as well, or maybe an aesthetic virus in its repetition and reproduction of this digitally transformed images contained within the, let's say, the sticky platform environment. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think there's something like, I'm really like, not the mimetic quality of that particular format of how do we look and how do we self-represent is super interesting, both in terms of how it's been sort of exploded now, because we're literally glued to the screen, but also how it relates to a particular history of how we understood contagions. So the one part of the history are the theories of mimetic evolution that, and I'm saying the name only because of the historical value, but Richard Dawkins developed in 70s and 80s as well, about the sort of what is the version of genetic evolution as the mimetic cultural evolution as well, right? And then of course how it filters into our current uses of the meme as well. So there's ways in which it was built into how we thought contagions, or let's say spreading and infections, would happen as well. So that would be the sort of ways in which it was built into our understanding of what it would be. And I'm not saying if it's right or wrong, and in most cases Dawkins is horribly wrong, but it's an interesting cultural trait. And now the other part of the answer would be something that we, I think, discussed just a bit earlier as well, about platforms, right? So, okay, if it's partly about a certain kind of a cultural repetition and pattern, it's very much being amplified across a particular platforms, to state the obvious. But I think that qualifies the idea of contagion in a particular way, because it becomes part of those data streams. So it's not only the projection of a particular format of an identity in terms of a face, not that it's, you know, it's important for reasons of all kinds of reasons, from, you know, whatever we feel in terms of mental health and all that, but also the other way around, that it also sucks us into a particular format of data platforms and capitalism and whatnot. It's not only capitalism in terms of different platforms, but I think you know what I mean by this already. So this sort of a like connection, and the ways in which this question of the face as an expansion of already the sort of a logic of avatars from game-like environments spreads into this sort of a like constant augmented reality experiment that we're living as well, but also becomes a way of, I guess, then really again discussing those questions of data capture as well, of how do we look, and what does it mean in relation to the platform and a particular sort of repetition that we are part of as well. And again, this would be the question where I think some of my colleague Tony Sampson's work would be really relevant as well, because he's really tied the notion of contagion to the history of social theory. And you might know this already, Natalia. I don't want to be, you know, explaining. You might know this really well. So I'm just saying that, you know, for anyone who doesn't, but Tony's work in terms of, you know, the contagion as a format of social theory, from Gabriel Tard's work in early 20th century to contemporary forms, is the format where this meets the question of data platforms, right? So on the one hand, the social theory of contagion, as that for Tard was the key way that we are social, is through contagion and the micro gesturing that we're constantly adapting to, and then the format of you know, data. So something that I think that's pretty much the thing that I would want to answer with that. That was a great question. Thank you.
Okay, I guess that as promised, which is not to be taken for granted in Italy, it's 7:30 Rome time, and we can call it a day. Thank you so much, Jussi, for having been with us, even in this virtual setting. And we look forward to seeing you in the actual site, John Cabot University in Rome, hopefully very soon.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for engaging with us in this discussion. And I also want to thank Azelia Terzi, our events coordinator, Letizia Lasorte, our intern at the
Professor.
The Com department, overall, our students, the university, the media lab, and pretty much everyone who has made this lecture series possible. And I wish you a good evening. Contagious-free evening.
Thank you. Bye, Jussi.
Good evening.
Thank you,
Thank
Jussi.
you so much.
Thank you.
Grazie. Grazie per essere
Thank
stato
you,
qui.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.